Rachel had always been the life of the party, her laughter infectious and her charm impossible to ignore. A natural people-pleaser, she drew friends and strangers alike to her, captivating everyone with stories and her undivided attention. Married to John for nearly 15 years, she had carved out a stable life. Their quiet home in Vermont was the envy of their friends, who saw them as a model couple, a perception that Rachel enjoyed reinforcing. But recently, the spark seemed to be waning. John had started working longer hours, growing his business as a furniture craftsman, often staying up late, meticulously refining his latest designs. The demands on his time left him drained and distant, something Rachel hadn't anticipated when she married him. She had married the man who made her laugh, the one who showered her with romantic gestures, not this silent figure hunched over a workbench, his fingers rough with calluses. Rachel's discontent grew in subtle ways at first. She filled her time with brunches and volunteer work, becoming a beloved figure in the local community center. It was during one of these volunteer shifts that she met Thomas, a retired novelist who had recently moved to Vermont from New York. Thomas was older, his hair already gray, but his wit was sharp and his presence captivating. He had stories from his years in the city, and his quiet charm drew Rachel in like a moth to flame. At first, their connection was innocent enough. They shared coffee at the community center, exchanged book recommendations, and occasionally went for long walks on the nearby trails. They talked about life, dreams, and regrets, and Rachel found herself eagerly awaiting each conversation. Thomas was like a breath of fresh air, a reminder of the world beyond her domestic responsibilities and John's late-night work sessions. But as the weeks passed, the boundary between friendship and something more began to blur. Thomas was attentive, often complimenting her on things John seemed to overlook. One day, over a shared glass of wine in a quiet corner of a cafe, Thomas leaned forward, his voice low and intimate. "You deserve to be seen, Rachel. Truly seen." The words struck her deeply. She hadn't realized how long it had been since someone looked at her with such admiration, with such intensity. And in a moment of weakness, Rachel leaned in, allowing the pull of the moment to sweep her away. After that moment in the cafe, Rachel knew she had crossed a line. A thrill ran through her, mixed with guilt that lingered like a shadow. She told herself it had just been a kiss, something she could forget and never mention to John. But in the days that followed, she found herself returning to that moment with Thomas. The allure of his attention, the feeling of being cherished, was addictive. The affair started gradually. Rachel would invent harmless reasons to leave the house. Errands, shopping trips, volunteer work, and each time, she would find her way to Thomas. Their meetings were brief, cloaked in secrecy, and yet, each encounter felt like a lifeline, drawing her deeper and deeper into a web of lies. Thomas was intoxicating, his presence a powerful escape from the ordinary routine of her life. She felt like someone new when she was with him, someone alive and daring. For a while, she managed to keep the affair hidden. John was busy with his projects, and Rachel became adept at weaving stories to cover her tracks. But secrets have a way of leaving clues, and it was only a matter of time before John began to sense that something was wrong. It started with the little things. He noticed how Rachel would come home late from her so-called volunteer work, flushed and energized. Her excuses were flimsy, and she seemed to spend an unusual amount of time on her phone, a habit she'd never had before. But every time he questioned her, Rachel brushed it off, giving him a quick kiss and a reassuring smile. Then one evening, John found himself scrolling through their shared calendar, trying to plan a weekend getaway to rekindle the spark in their marriage. That's when he saw a curious pattern in her schedule. There were several volunteer events listed that he knew for a fact didn't exist, as he casually checked with her friends at the community center once or twice. A knot of unease twisted in his stomach. Rachel had always been honest with him, or so he'd thought. Determined to find answers, he decided not to confront her immediately. Instead, he would keep an eye on her, watch for any more signs that might confirm his suspicions. Over the next few weeks, John became a silent observer in his own marriage. He watched Rachel's behavior with an unsettling awareness, his heart heavy with a suspicion he couldn't bear to accept. He saw the glances she cast at her phone, the way her mood shifted when she returned from her errands. And one evening, as she left for yet another one of her unexplained trips, John felt the weight of her absence settle over him like a shroud. That night, after Rachel had left, John decided to follow her. He waited until she was out of sight, then got into his car, keeping a safe distance behind. He watched as she drove across town, pulling up in front of a small, cozy cafe. Inside, through the windows, he saw her meet with a man he didn't recognize, a man who leaned in close to her, touching her hand in a way that told John all he needed to know. The pain was immediate, raw, and searing. The trust he had built with Rachel over years of marriage shattered in an instant. He wanted to burst into that cafe, to demand answers, but something held him back. Instead, he sat in his car, watching as the two of them shared an intimate conversation, oblivious to his presence. When Rachel finally left the cafe and drove home, John didn't follow her. He sat there, numb and shaken, his mind racing with emotions he couldn't contain. Betrayal, anger, sorrow, all of it swirled within him, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own life. But beneath the hurt, a new resolve began to take shape. John decided he would get even, but it wouldn't be a loud, vengeful confrontation. No, he would approach this with precision, with the same meticulous care he used in his woodworking. He would make Rachel feel the weight of her actions in ways she could never anticipate. That night, while Rachel slept beside him, John began to plan his revenge. John spent the following days consumed by a grim determination. During the quiet hours of the night, he meticulously crafted a plan that would shake Rachel to her core. This wasn't just about exposing her betrayal. It was about making her feel the depth of his pain, in ways she would never forget. As a craftsman, John's skill lay in details. He knew how to manipulate wood to reveal its hidden beauty, and now, he would apply the same patience to his plan. His approach would be subtle, almost undetectable, like the faint smell of varnish slowly spreading through their home. The first step was to continue acting as though nothing had changed. He was as warm and attentive as ever, even surprising Rachel with small gifts and gestures she hadn't seen in years. She seemed grateful, even guilty, which only spurred him on. He noticed that she occasionally hesitated, as if wondering if he knew, but his pleasant demeanor lulled her into a false sense of security. Meanwhile, John's plan took shape. He spent his evenings perfecting a new piece of work, a delicate, mahogany box that he carved with painstaking care. The box was small but intricate, with hidden compartments that only he could open. For Rachel, this box would be an offering, a trap carefully wrapped in beauty. When it was finished, he filled it with letters, each one a crafted illusion. They told the story of an affair, not Rachel's, but his own. John poured everything he wanted her to feel into those words. Each letter spoke of secrets, of passion with a fictional lover who made him feel alive, cherished, in ways Rachel had never imagined. Each letter was dated and signed, creating a vivid timeline that hinted at years of hidden betrayal. Once he was satisfied, John placed the box on her vanity, leaving a small note on top, for when you're ready to know the truth. He watched her the next morning as she saw the box, her expression a mixture of curiosity and dread. But she didn't open it immediately. Instead, she tucked it away, her face clouded with confusion and guilt. In the days that followed, John continued to observe Rachel closely. He saw her glancing at the box occasionally, wrestling with whether to open it. He knew she was tormented by the possibilities it contained. It wasn't until a few nights later, when she thought he was asleep, that she finally took it from her vanity. John pretended to be asleep, listening as she unlocked the box, gasping softly at its contents. He could almost feel her tension as she read the letters, each one a cruel mirror of her own actions. She read in silence, her hands trembling, as if with every page, she was uncovering a piece of her own heartache and betrayal. When she finally put the box away, she lay still beside him, her breaths shallow and uneven. She didn't confront him, didn't even hint that she knew. But the knowledge lingered between them, thick as smoke. Over the following days, Rachel's behavior shifted. She was quieter, more attentive, as though trying to bridge a gap that only she could feel. She stopped leaving for her clandestine meetings with Thomas, and John saw her linger around him with a newfound intensity. But John wasn't finished yet. The final part of his plan required a trip to a secluded cabin he owned in the mountains. They had gone there a few times in the past, and he suggested a getaway, just the two of them. Rachel eagerly agreed, her enthusiasm tinged with the desperation of someone seeking redemption. Once there, in the quiet isolation of the cabin, John decided to confront her. After a casual dinner, as they sat by the fire, he turned to her, his gaze steady. "Rachel," he began, his voice calm. "I know." Rachel's face paled, her eyes widening with shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down, her fingers twisting nervously. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" he asked, his tone cool but laced with sorrow. Rachel stammered, her words tumbling out in fragmented sentences. She apologized, pleaded for understanding, tried to justify her actions, but her words only deepened the silence between them. John listened, nodding occasionally, letting her exhaust herself. When she was done, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now you understand, don't you? The hurt, the betrayal, the feeling of your life shattering piece by piece." Rachel looked up, confused. "What are you talking about?" John smiled, his expression one of quiet triumph. "The box, Rachel. Those letters. Did you read them?" Her face went pale again, this time with a different kind of horror. She nodded slowly. "They were lies," he said, his voice a low, controlled murmur. "I never had an affair, Rachel, but I needed you to feel what I felt, to know how it feels to be deceived." Rachel's face twisted in anguish, her hands trembling as she stared at him, understanding dawning like a bitter sunrise. John had orchestrated everything, leading her to believe he'd betrayed her, only to reveal the truth in the cruelest way possible. You lied," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Yes," he replied simply. "I lied to make you feel the truth." The silence in the cabin was dense, filled with Rachel's stunned disbelief and John's simmering satisfaction. She sat across from him, her face ghostly white, the weight of what he'd done pressing down on her like a stone. She knew she had hurt him, but never in her wildest nightmares had she expected this calculated act of revenge. "John, I don't even know what to say," she murmured, her voice a hollow whisper. I don't even recognize you right now." John tilted his head, watching her as if she were a puzzle he had finally solved. "That's exactly how I felt when I saw you with him. It's terrifying to look at someone you love and realize they're a stranger. So I thought I'd give you the same experience." Rachel's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time in months, she saw John's anguish mirrored in her own reflection. "I made a mistake, John. A terrible mistake. But I don't know how to make you understand." John shook his head, his face hard. "Understand? You want me to understand how it felt for you to betray me? I trusted you, Rachel. I never once doubted you. And you threw it away for what? Some fleeting thrill? I was lonely, John. You were always in the workshop, and I felt invisible," she admitted, struggling to find the right words. "Thomas made me feel alive, and I know how wrong that was now. But I never stopped loving you." "Love?" John scoffed. "You call that love?" Rachel winced, feeling the sting of his words. But she knew there was no defense, no excuse that could undo what she had done. She wanted to reach out, to tell him how sorry she was, but she sensed that any plea for forgiveness would only widen the chasm between them. They spent the rest of the weekend in a tense silence. Each word exchanged felt like a reminder of the wounds they had inflicted on each other. Rachel tried to salvage the remnants of their trip, cooking his favorite meals and offering gestures of affection. But John remained cold, distant. By the time they returned home, both were exhausted, their hearts heavy with the unspoken bitterness between them. Back in their house, the silence between them grew louder. Rachel had stopped going to the community center, cutting off all contact with Thomas. But John didn't seem to notice or care. He busied himself in his workshop, throwing himself into new projects with a fervor that bordered on obsession. For a while, Rachel thought he might leave her, that he would file for divorce and cast her aside. But he didn't. He stayed, a silent presence in her life, withholding any hint of forgiveness or reconciliation. She found herself living on the edge, waking up each day with the dread that he might finally have had enough. Months passed, and slowly, Rachel's remorse began to give way to resentment. She had confessed her guilt, cut ties with Thomas, and done everything in her power to rebuild their marriage. But John's icy demeanor never softened. She began to feel as though she were being punished endlessly, with no end in sight. The torment was relentless, and Rachel's patience wore thin. One evening, she couldn't bear it any longer. After a tense dinner where John barely looked at her, she finally snapped. "John, how long are you going to keep punishing me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "I know what I did was wrong, but I can't spend the rest of my life atoning for it if you won't even give me a chance." John looked at her, his gaze unreadable. "You think this is punishment, Rachel? This is restraint. If I really wanted to punish you, you wouldn't still be here." His words cut deep, and Rachel felt her own anger flare. "Then why am I still here? Why haven't you left if you can't forgive me?" "Because leaving would be easy," he replied, his voice low and controlled. "And you don't deserve easy." Rachel's hands trembled as she struggled to contain her emotions. She realized that in John's mind, this endless coldness was a form of justice. He intended to stay, to watch her suffer, to make her live with the knowledge of what she'd done every single day. And the realization was crushing. That night, as she lay in bed alone, Rachel's mind churned with the weight of their shattered relationship. She couldn't help but wonder if there was any way forward for them, or if they were destined to spend their lives locked in a cycle of silent bitterness. But as she lay there, a new thought began to take root. If John couldn't forgive her, if he couldn't find it in himself to let go of his anger, then perhaps she needed to take matters into her own hands. She realized that she was no longer willing to be a prisoner of his revenge. The next morning, she waited for him in the kitchen, her heart pounding as she rehearsed her words. When he finally appeared, his expression as cold as ever, she took a deep breath. "John," she began, her voice steady but filled with resolve, "I understand that you're hurt. I understand why you feel the way you do. But I can't keep living like this. If you can't forgive me, then maybe it's time for us to let each other go." John's eyes widened, and for the first time in months, Rachel saw a crack in his stoic exterior. But he quickly masked it, his face hardening. "Is that what you want, Rachel?" he asked, his tone laced with bitterness. "To walk away now, after everything you've done?" She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I want a chance to make things right. But if you're not willing to let me do that, then yes. Maybe it's time to let each other go." John was silent, his face a mix of anger and surprise. She could see the gears turning in his mind, the turmoil of emotions he had buried beneath his calm facade. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, as if the prospect of losing her was something he hadn't fully considered. Finally, he spoke, his voice a whisper. "I never wanted it to come to this, Rachel. But I don't know if I can ever forget what you did." Rachel nodded, her heart aching but resolute. "I understand, John, but I can't live in the past forever. If we can't move forward together, then maybe it's time to move forward separately." John looked away, his shoulders slumping as the weight of her words settled over him. She could see the battle within him, the struggle between his anger and the love that still lingered beneath the surface. As they stood there in silence, both caught in the tension of their broken bond, Rachel felt a strange sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she couldn't keep living under the shadow of John's resentment. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to let go of the one you love. The days that followed were filled with a strange calm. Rachel and John coexisted under the same roof, yet they were more like strangers than spouses, bound only by shared history and the walls they called home. The quiet tension between them was no longer oppressive, though. It had softened into something else, something sad but strangely liberating. They had reached an unspoken agreement, a truce that acknowledged the end of their marriage was inevitable. They began dividing their belongings, discussing practical matters with a detachment that surprised them both. John retreated to his workshop for long hours, his mind immersed in new projects, while Rachel occupied herself with finding a small place nearby, somewhere she could make a fresh start. Yet, despite the distance growing between them, neither made a definitive move to leave. It was as though they were caught in the gentle pull of a tide, waiting to see where it would take them. One evening, as Rachel was packing up a box of old family photos, John entered the room and hesitated at the doorway. She looked up, startled, and they stood there, silent, the weight of years hanging in the space between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than she'd heard in months. "Do you remember the first time we came here, when we bought this place?" Rachel nodded, her heart twisting with the bittersweet memory. "It was our first home. We were so proud of it, even though it was barely furnished." John managed a faint smile, his eyes distant. "You insisted on painting the living room that horrible shade of green, and I went along with it, even though I hated it." Rachel laughed softly, surprised by the warmth that welled up in her chest. "I remember. I thought it would be bold, but it was terrible. You were right." They shared a small, tentative smile, both of them surprised at the ease of their conversation. It was the first time they'd laughed together in months, and for a moment, the years of pain and betrayal seemed to melt away. As the laughter faded, John looked at her, his expression shifting to something deeper, something raw. "Rachel, I don't know if I can forgive what you did, but I think I understand why you felt the way you did, and I don't want to live like this anymore. Not with this anger." Rachel's heart leaped, hope flickering in a place she'd thought long dead. She nodded, her voice trembling. "Neither do I, but I'm afraid we're both so broken that it's too late to fix things." John took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe, but maybe we can try. Not for what we were, but for what we can be now. I think I'm ready to move forward, with or without this bitterness. Maybe we've both paid enough." Rachel swallowed, feeling a mix of relief and grief. She wanted to reach out, to take his hand and hold on to that spark, but she knew better than to rush into hope. They had miles to go before they could even consider calling themselves whole. "Then let's start over," she said quietly, her voice filled with the weight of all they'd been through, whatever that means. In the weeks that followed, they approached each other with a tentative kindness, one that wasn't quite love but wasn't entirely gone either. They didn't try to reclaim their old life. Instead, they built something new, a fragile piece that allowed them to exist in the same space without the baggage of the past weighing them down. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Rachel looked over at John, her heart full but unsure. "Do you ever think about what we would have been like if none of this had happened?" John considered this, his gaze softening. "Maybe we were supposed to go through all of this to see each other clearly. Maybe, somehow, it brought us closer to who we really are." Rachel smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Maybe." And as they sat there, side by side, in the quiet warmth of the room, they both felt a strange sense of contentment. They had broken each other and rebuilt themselves, piecing together something new, something unexpected. Whatever lay ahead, they knew they would face it together. Not as the people they once were, but as two flawed, resilient souls who had chosen to stay and face the future with eyes open, ready for whatever came next. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.